Changemakers is a movement created by the Manny Cantor Center, engaging New Yorkers to take action. I'm Eden Perlov with the America 101 Project. With my co-founder Lily Nussbaum, we created the America 101 Project out of a desire to learn more about timely topics from the people who know them intimately and can share a unique perspective. Today, we'll be speaking with Meeta Anand about the current US Census. Meeta is the New York Immigration Coalition's Census 2020 Senior Fellow, spearheading the organization's efforts to ensure a complete and accurate count of New Yorkers in the 2020 census. Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Meeta Anand, and I'm the Census 2020 Senior Fellow at the New York Immigration Coalition. And in that role, I help to spearhead New York Immigration Coalition's activities around census, strategize around census outreach, and I also serve as the facilitator and convener of New York Counts 2020, which is the statewide coalition of organizations in New York State working for a fair and accurate census.
Amazing. For those who might not exactly know, what is the census and what does it help determine? Why is it so important?
Sure, absolutely. So the census is actually constitutionally mandated. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution, which means that the founding fathers thought it was one of the first things we had to worry about. And it's a count of every person living on US soil as of a specific date every 10 years. So this year, the specific date is April 1st, 2020. And like I said, it's every 10 years. So it also means the next one is not until 2030. What it helps determine is what we like to call money, power, and respect. So money is federal funding. So every year about $1.5 trillion of federal funds are allocated to states based on census data. And this is money that goes towards things like healthcare, hospitals, first responders, schools, roads, workforce assistance. So really a lot of things that we rely on as a society. And if you think about it, New Yorkers pay taxes, for instance. We all know that. And one thing we all know is that New York pays out more to the federal government than it gets back. And that's because that money is being allocated all over the place based on census data and state's population. The power aspect has to do with representation. So the number of congressional seats we have is based on the size of our population. So back in 1940, New York State had 45 representatives in Congress, just Congress, I'm not including the Senate. And now it's down to 27. And that's just because certain states have increased their population. And New York has slowly lost some population. But it's also because New York State hasn't been the best at counting every single one of its residents. And then the respect portion really has to do with this is one thing that we can all engage in. So voting is not open to everybody. We know that. Becoming an elected official is not necessarily something that everybody wants to do, and that's quite a process. But one thing we can all do in democracy is be counted. And through being counted, that allows us to help our neighborhoods to be able to get those resources I was referring to, and to also help determine who's fighting for us in DC. And if I can make one more point about representation, a lot of people think about it just in terms of number of seats in Congress, but there are two more points. One is the number of seats we have in Congress feeds up into our count of electoral college representation. And as you know, that determines, the votes for the president. So, for instance, New York, if it votes a certain way, New York allocates all of its electoral college votes to the winner of the New York State election. The number of votes we have is based on our congressional representation, which is based on our population. So how much we get to influence the presidential election is based on the census, but also like how we draw district lines for local representation. So really can affect who is representing you at a local level and what type of effect you have at a local level. So for all these reasons, we view it as fundamental to our democracy, but also just really important so that we can make sure that our communities are able to have a say in what their future looks like.
That makes complete sense. And you mentioned a little bit about how it's counting every single person in your state or on US soil. How do we count groups that might be more difficult to count, such as the homeless population or immigrant communities?
Sure, I'll take the immigrant community question first. So there are many reasons why certain groups might not fill out the census. It can be either because they what I like to call it's a failure of intention, and I don't mean they've failed, but like they don't want to engage with the census. And why might they not want to engage with it? And that could be anything from fear and mistrust of the government, which comes either from like historic interactions with the government in this country, or what they're feeling in terms of how the government is acting towards them. Like immigrant groups feel a lot of hostility from the federal government these days, or it can come from their home countries where they might not have had a good interaction with the government. It also can be that some people just don't think the census applies to them. So they automatically assume that it's only for citizens. And as you and I have both emphasized, it's not. It counts every single resident, anyone living here. Some people assume that it's the same thing as voting. So like, you know, I actually have had friends say to me like, well, you know, I'm not registered to vote, so I shouldn't fill out the census. And it's like, wait a minute, no, like, just like read the form. It's clear, it's for everybody. So that's really part of it, is trying to overcome that apprehension of the government. And then the other piece too is, especially in New York City, this is something we see, there's a lot of non-traditional housing arrangements. And we've actually heard a lot of this in the time of COVID about how certain communities, like they live in a far more dense manner, not just, you know, on a block by block basis, but even within the home. And these are not necessarily traditional family units or traditional households. So, you know, one family might receive the census and fill it out, but it's an apartment that has 3 families in it, or no families whatsoever, and it's like 20 workers that share a space. So, you know, having people understand that applies to them it is really one barrier. And then the other barrier is an access issue. And that's like, in New York City, I think it's over 200 separate languages are spoken. So how do you know, bridge that divide? The Census Bureau has tried to bridge part of it. You can fill out the census online in 13 different languages. They have language guides for 59 languages. So like, that's a lot, right? But that's not 200. So how do you overcome the language divide? And then something I think we'll be talking about maybe later, the digital divide, where this census is a census that's online. And most of our census response right now has been driven by answering online. But if you don't have access to the internet, that facility of answering it online is not something you have. And you, I mean, you and I both know this, like, it takes us longer to fill something out by paper and shove it in an envelope and send it in, and you can misplace it in the meanwhile. I think you also asked about the homeless population. That is a very interesting question. So traditionally, counting the homeless has been done in 2 ways. One is what they call a service-based enumeration, where they go to locations where homeless people traditionally receive services, and they do a count there. So, you know, you can think of a food pantry, you can think of a place where they go to receive job counseling or whatever counseling, like you can get enumeration there. And then the second way is normally the night of April 1st is the census homeless count. And people go out onto the street and to the places that they know you normally find homeless people, and they count them there. So that's how it's normally done. As you can imagine, with the pandemic, neither has happened yet. That has been placed on hold. We do not know when it will happen. And there are other challenges too within that, which are namely that, especially as we've seen in New York City, like where the homeless people are located overnight is shifting a lot too. And that really requires partnering with local on-the-ground organizations to be able to understand, where can you go to count them? So there are, it is difficult, but there are means of overcoming it, right? And that's usually partnering with local organizations to overcome, to help identify where to find the homeless people, to include them in the count. With the immigrant community, it's really about finding trusted messengers to help them understand that the census is actually essential and it benefits them, and their information provided is protected. So they shouldn't worry about their interaction with the Census Bureau, even though they might be worrying about their interaction with the government in other arenas.
I think you've touched on both how COVID has affected this a little bit, but I'm curious. You also mentioned people are nervous because of their relationships with either the government or their past governments. What would you tell people who might be afraid to take the census and getting their information to them?
Absolutely. So a couple of things there. One is the Census Bureau does not share information with any other arm of the government or anyone at all. They collect data purely for statistical purposes. It's not to collect data on an individual per se. It is literally to aggregate it and then to be able to say, in this neighborhood, X number of people live here. So that is one part. And then they don't share it with anyone. And by anyone, I mean no other federal agency, no state government agency, no local government agency. They don't share it with landlords. And this is due to something called Title 13 of the US Code, which makes it illegal to share census data on an individual level for 72 years. So information given to the Census Bureau now cannot be revealed to anyone till 2092. And not only that, there are stiff penalties associated with it. So if someone is found to have violated that, they'll be fined $250,000, which is not insignificant, and face up to 5 years in jail. And various studies done by legal organizations have found that this is actually not only strong penalties, but it is also supplemented by legal cases where the Supreme Court, for instance, has emphasized that the privacy of census data is an essential part of the census. So there's an entire infrastructure of government that understands how this information is to be held private, and that is core to being able to complete the census. The other thing I would say is that a lot of community organizations have signed a pledge that they are serving as watchdogs to ensure that they have the community's back. And it's not because we don't believe in the protections that exist, but literally just to give that extra layer of reassurance to say, no, we know you and we've had your back before and we will continue to have your back, and we are watching and making sure nothing goes wrong.
How has COVID affected the census this year and the changes in the timeline?
Sure. So I alluded to part of the timeline issues before. The homelessness count, for instance, would have been on April 1st. And as of now, we don't even know when it will be, because that has to do with when will conditions improve on the ground and allow for some relaxation of social distancing rules. So the census timeline, fascinatingly enough, you and I are speaking on May 11th. In a non-COVID world, I would have been saying to you, in 2 days, the door knockers, the people who come and check and say you haven't filled it out, you know, I want to speak to you about the census, they would have started coming in 2 days. They're not coming in 2 days. As of now, they're expected to start coming on August 11th, which is fascinating because the census was supposed to end on July 31st. So if you can imagine, they're coming after this was even supposed to be over. And the census is now extended till October 31st. And that's because there's a recognition that the Census Bureau itself can't go out there and door knock. And a lot of their hiring, for instance, hasn't happened because they're not able to do things like fingerprint and background check employees. But that's only one component of how COVID has affected it. We've already talked about harder to reach communities like immigrant communities, and this also applies to African American communities, low income communities, renters. There are many communities that have traditionally, you know, not participated as robustly in the census. And many organizations such as our own had plans for how to engage these communities in the importance of the census and to help reassure them that their information would be protected. And that involved a lot of in-person communication. It involved door-to-door visits. It involved huge community events. So it involved setting up census access points where people could fill out the census, you know, when they went to do something else for their community. Like if they go to a community center, they could fill out the census right then and there. So all of those outreach efforts, I wouldn't say have ended, but they look different than they would have looked otherwise, which makes it harder. And what we have also noticed is that those communities that historically have not responded to the census in as robust a manner as we would wish, there's a high correlation between those communities and the communities most impacted by the pandemic. So you can understand that it is not top of mind for them to fill out the census. Of course, for us, it's top of mind for us because we know the best way to ensure we're healthy and resilient going forward is to have as many of us complete it as possible.
This is the first year that technology has been incorporated into the census. People are able to fill it out online. Has that helped while people are in quarantine? Have you seen the numbers seem to be correlating with that, or has it been a hindrance? What has it been like?
It's a mixed blessing. So, you know, for certain groups that are at home and have internet access, then sure, they are responding very well, you know, and at pretty high rates. The internet response rate, I think, accounts for approximately 80% of all responses that the Census Bureau has received so far. The other ways you can respond are by paper form. Anyone who did not fill out a paper form fill it out online by about mid-April, they should have received a paper form since then. And you can also phone in a response. So, but the internet response is really driving the response rates. But as you can imagine, not everyone has internet access. And harkening back to my last statement, one of the ways we were dealing with that was to engage with the library system. And, you know, that's a free place for anyone to go into, and they were going to have census navigators set up and everything. The libraries are closed. So that makes it really difficult for people who do not have the internet. Or if they do, it's limited, or it's, you know, it's dial-up and not broadband. They might not want to be spending their time, precious time online filling out the census. And the other interesting bit about it is that the elderly are usually quite good at responding to the census. Just like voting, we know that the elderly are one of the more reliable voting blocks. They're also one of the more reliable census completers. But the internet component has shifted that, and the elderly are used to receiving the paper form that we all used to receive. So what we've seen is that those neighborhoods where the Census Bureau pre-identified them as probably not having really good internet access, those neighborhoods actually are lagging in response rates. So it's played out as expected, but those are exactly the groups that we need to be able to do the outreach to. And that leads to a kind of twisted irony, because outreach right now is primarily being done online. So it makes the outreach to those groups a bit more difficult. I will say one positive thing though, which is that census response rates are being updated on a daily basis on a tract by tract level. So it helps anyone that's working on the census or anyone who's interested in it. You can go online and look up the response rates, and you can even type in your address and find out the response rate for your census tract. And it really helps to think about what strategies should be used and who's not being included. And that's why I'm able, for instance, to say to you, no, we can see which neighborhoods are lagging. And it's because that level of the online aspect has been incredibly helpful in providing information to everyone doing the work.
And I think that leads into my next question, which is like, how can we help to ensure that our community is counted?
Yeah, it does lead very well into that. So firstly, I would hope anyone listening to us has already completed the census. I'm actually just going to assume they have. So, great job. But what we need to ensure now is like, you're not done. Now you need to persuade everyone you know, your friends, your family, your colleagues, your book club, to fill out the census. And one of the ways to even start engaging with people about it is this map that I'm talking about. And if you Google CUNY hard to count map, you get this map and you can type in your address. And what I have found is like when you start playing around and compare your neighborhood to another neighborhood, or I always joke around that I always start by looking at Minnesota because that's where my in-laws live. And Minnesota is #1 in the nation on response rates. And so then I'm like, oh no, Minnesota's winning. And then I go and look at my neighborhood. But it also just allows you firstly to put it in context. And then you can start thinking about like, what is in my neighborhood? Like, can I write an email to my building if I live in a building, or slip notes under people's doors? Like, old-fashioned organizing had people doing letter writing campaigns. Like, that can still be done. You can hang a poster in your window. One thing I've been saying to people that they can do, we all get so many newsletters and emails and e-blasts to listservs. So lately, my new thing is I respond to them saying, thanks, can you please include some census messaging in your next email? So, like they're just things like just thinking through our network of who we know. Like, do you belong to a synagogue? Has your synagogue sent out census messaging? If not, can you reach out to your synagogue and ask them to? So slowly building through that. I think, like I said before, that still really relies on an online presence, but certain things don't. If you know that there's a grocery store in your neighborhood that people are still frequenting, maybe management there would be willing to put up a poster, or put a flyer in a bag. So it's really about figuring out ways to get the visibility into those neighborhoods that are not responding as robustly.
Amazing. And if people want to learn more about the census, is there a website that they can go to?
Yes, absolutely. NewYorkCounts2020.org. We have links to the map I was talking about. It tells you what New York's response rate is. It gives you tons of information on the census. And it gives you specific information like, how can I do outreach to farm workers? Like, how does it affect African Americans? What's the relationship between census and the environment? So, all of these things to really help you think about what it means to a specific subgroup of people that you might be wanting to talk to about the census.
Amazing. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it.
I had a blast. It's always a joy to talk with you.